Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week I'm gonna make a worm, but like with all the eyeballs. But of course that means we need to make our worm first. Now it's a common misconception that worms don't have bones, but in reality it's just that a worm's bones are made of the same tissue as the rest of their body, essentially rendering them invisible to the uneducated naked eye. My worm, however, needs some slightly stiffer bones, which I'll make out of some wound armature wire wrapped in aluminium foil. Speaking of which, I get a lot of comments asking me why I say aluminium instead of aluminum, and there's a good reason. Now once I've got my aluminium body built up, I'll begin the unclaying process, which involves putting clay on the model. This part of the process is really important in most clay models, since forgetting to add the clay means it'll be hard to sculpt the detail into it later. Though if you're short on funds, it is pretty cost efficient. With my clay covering my thick noodle boy, I can start to mark out the segments. The Eater of Worlds, or Kevin as he shall heretofore be called, is made up of hundreds of individually eyeballed body parts connected via a single nervous system that runs the length of his armature wire skeleton. And given that each of Kevin's section contains a set of eyes, I suppose I'll have to make a whole bunch of balls. Once I've got enough balls to cover the body, I can toss them in the oven to bake. Whoops, wrong tray. Ah, there we go. Now, with my balls baked and cooled, I can begin cutting them in half. Most of the eye's gonna be buried in the body anyways, so by cutting my balls in half, I can more easily fit them on Kevin's body, as well as cut down on the amount of baked balls I need. I can then poke a bunch of divots of varying sizes into Kevin's body before filling them with appropriately sized eyeball halves. I'll then poke a series of divots into Kevin's underside, into which I can fit all those pre-baked spikes I made earlier. Back to his eyeballs, I'll wrap them in some teeny tiny wormy dealies that I can then blend into the body before pressing them back from the eyeball to create some big, beautiful eyelids. Then it's on to some final texturing of the body so it's not quite so flat and boring, and I can begin the enmouthing process on the foremost Kevin section. I'll add a couple lumps of clay to the sides of his face that I can then stick some extra big spiky bits into before jamming a bunch of spikes into the center of his mouth hole as well as around the rim facing out. One final once over with some isopropyl alcohol to clean up any sharp edges and fingerprints, and that's Kevin's front third finished. I can then repeat most of the process twice more to give me his middle and back end. Otherwise, we're all set for some paint, starting with a nice white primer. However, before I paint them, I think I want to figure out how the base is going to work. Terraria takes place on a 2D plane, and I want to make my base as a 3-dimensional homage to that, so I've cut out a thick slab of XPS foam that I can fit Kevin onto. Now, Kevin also likes to swim through the dirt of the world, so I think by making one of the thirds below the surface, it should help to give the final piece some movement. I'll mark out where I want the body segments to enter the upside down, as well as some more choice sections of the block that I'll cut away to make it a little bit more interesting. Once I've got my marks in place, all that's left to do is chop away the excess. And of course, add a little rocky texture. Now, Kevin's going to be bursting out of the ground, so I want to make it look like he's displacing a bit of dirt, which I'll do by dry fitting him in place and using a little hole filler to build up some messy debris around his body. Finally, the foam's a little flat, so I want to add some static grass. And to apply my static grass, I'm going to use a static grass applicator. I'll cover wherever I want the grass to go in a way too thick layer of basin glue, then it's as easy as poking my foam with an overly long needle and shaking the grass out. I think a couple trees would look lovely in my soon-to-be purple field, so I've gathered up an extra long length of thin gauge armature wire that I'll wrap into a thick cord and cut to size before wrapping the bottom in another length of wire and stretching it out into a wonky fashion to make the tree roots. I'll then coat the wire in a layer of hot glue and stick it onto the back side of the base. The trees in Terraria are just lumps of leaves at the top, and I'm going to mimic that design by gluing some clump foliage to the top, and that's our base finished. Except, not unlike most elected officials, Kevin thrives in corruption, which means I need to paint this base black. With the base painted black, I can paint the dirty bits dirty brown and all the grassy bits corruption purple. The leaves on the trees will get a nice corrupt purple as well before painting the trunks with a lighter brown. I'll then give the entire base a heavy umber wash to tie the two colors together, as well as add a little shading. I'll then gently tickle the tips of the grass with a lighter purple dry brush, doing the same to the trees, followed by a lighter brown along the dirty sections, and that's our base all but finished. So it's time to get back to Kevin. Now I started painting Kevin with a heavy purpley brown wash, thinking this would save me time by bypassing the shading part of the process, but I ended up really disliking how splotchy and ugly it looked, so in the end I just gave him a full purpley brown base coat followed by a series of progressively lighter highlights applied with a sponge and some final bright highlighting applied via brush at the end. I then painted the inside of his mouth and the underside of his body with a charcoal black using some lighter grays to add a bit of interesting two-dimensional texture. Finally, to bring all the colors together and add a bit of shading and make Kevin look a little grungier, I gave his whole body a brown wash that I then sponged away with a sponge, I guess. Then all his teeth and spiky bits got a brownish-greenish base coat followed by a couple lighter glazes of the slightly lighter version of that same color. Because I didn't mask off the eyes, I'll use my airbrush to get that initial whiteness back into them before using my brush to get the crisper lines around the edge as well as add a little redness to the rims since Kevin's been plowing through corrupted dirt with his eyes wide open. Rather than trust my shaky hands, I've dipped some circle cutters in black paint to make the initial edge of the iris, which I can then paint green inside. The green's a little flat though, so I'm gonna dip the tip of a sponge into some watery green and use that to add some depth to the larger irises, while using a cotton bud for the smaller ones. Finally, a little cotton bud dipped in black will add pupils to the big eyes, and a ball stylus will help finish off the small ones. Normally I like to coat my eyes in UV resin, but given how many eyes Kevin has, I think a couple coats of high gloss varnish will have to suffice. Last but not least, if you've been here before, you know I like to goop up my monster mouths with a little drool, which I'm gonna make by draping some Tacky Glue between the teeth to create some nice goopy strings of saliva. Finally, Kevin can be affixed to the base with a little hot glue and a lot of love. And with that, we're not done yet, because I've got a big empty space on my base begging for a hero. Now, the Eater of Worlds head is slightly larger than the size of the hero in Terraria, which means I need to make a teeny tiny hero that fits comfortably into the 28mm scale. This is, of course, an entirely arbitrary number to throw at you since it's not like I'm going to be checking my proportions at any point while I make this model. I just wasn't sure what to say to introduce this part of the project. Basically, when it comes to making miniatures, I just start making it and hope that it fits into whatever I've made and it doesn't look too out of place. Fortunately, I'm scaling this little armor-clad hero to fight against a massive earthworm covered in oversized eyeballs, so I can probably get away with just about anything as long as his body proportions are roughly correct in regards to his own scale. Again, I'm not actually going to check this at any point, so who knows how this is going to turn out. Instead, let's go on this journey together and see just how wonky this little mini ends up. At this point, I've built up his sabatons, greaves, and a chest plate with a fancy little gorget, which means I've at least got a body scale that I can make my head to fit. Last time I made a Terrarian, I made him wearing the silver armor, but this time I wanted to give him some gold, which means I need to make a face since the gold armor leaves the face exposed. I'll start by plopping down a little ball of clay onto a wooden handle and getting the general shape of the head sorted out before poking some little eyes and a nose into it, then opening his mouth in a scream since he's going to be facing down his imminent demise. After all, he's wearing gold armor to fight the Eater of Worlds, and I don't like his odds. A little refining of the shape and I can bake the head in the oven, then pry it off the block and mount it on a toothpick before building up the helmet. Now the toothpick serves two main purposes, the first being that it gives me something to hold while I add the helmet, and the second purpose being that it will help to remind you, the viewer, just how small a 28mm mini actually is. Finally, I can attach some wings to the sides of my golden helmet and I can press the whole thing into the still soft clay of the gorget. Then I can stick some wire into the shoulder for his arms and wrap those in clay. I'll pinch one of the tips into a little mitten that I can wrap around my thinnest armature wire, which will be a future weapon, and the other arm gets pinched into a mitten wrapped around a slightly thicker wire. I'll then add some little fingers and a thumb before turning the lumpy arms into armor. Now what's a heroic hero without a heroic hero's cape? I've squished out a thin but not too thin sheet of clay that I can cut my cape shape out of, then add some wrinkles and motion and attach it to my hero's back so it's fluttering heroically in the wind. To keep the cape in place, I'll smoosh a couple little balls onto his shoulders and shape them into pauldrons, and it's into the oven to bake. Once he's out of the oven, I'll bend a slightly longer length of my little wire into a wavy wire, then replace the one he's holding with the wobbly one. Finally, I'll fit a teeny tiny yo-yo onto the tip of the wire and attach a little shield to his other arm, and that's my tiny terrarian as terraria ready as can be. All he needs now is a black primer, followed by a white zenithal, and he's ready for some paint. I'll give his face a wash with some pale flesh tones before realizing I forgot to give him a belt, which I'll quickly add off camera. I can then paint all his armory bits with a couple coats of gold until he's got a nice uniform shiny golden base coat. I've also painted all his under armor black, and I can paint his cape with a lovely red. His shield and the yo-yo both get a base coating with natural steel, and I'll tint the shield blue and the yo-yo green. Once the shield's dried, I'll come back and add a little yellow cross to at least level up his defense a little bit. I'll then paint the belt and coin pouch brown and the potions red and blue. Finally, once everything's had a chance to dry, I'll give the golden armor a sepia wash to tarnish it a tiny bit before giving all the shiny golden bits an edge highlighting with silver. Otherwise, that's my little underprepared hero ready to be dropped in place, and with that, we're all finished here and onto the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to my wonderful patrons of Patreon, and a special hey how are you to my newest patrons, Kara Martin, Amber Marie, Ezra Donahue, Deal Moran, Sabercat Wolves, Josh and Cassandra, Aaron and Heather, Bella, Lauren, Peter and Maybay, Jennifer Osborne, MJ Enjoys Murder and Crafts, Martin Hoven, Agnes RJ, and John Was Gone. You are the limitless number of eyes through which this channel's long noodle body looks. Yeah, I don't have much to say, so thanks for watching, you're the tits. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.